24 hours after a woman lay dead on a Minneapolis street, we still do not know the most important thing. Not what officials say happened, but what actually did. I'm Fareed Zakaria, and I want you to sit with that discomfort for a moment. A federal officer fires 3 shots. A vehicle rolls forward. Video exists, but not enough. Statements come fast, but answers do not. The president speaks. The Homeland Security Secretary speaks. They tell us this was clear. They tell us it was justified. But clarity is not declared. It is earned. And when state investigators are pushed aside, when footage raises more questions than it resolves, when power moves faster than truth, something deeper is at stake than a single encounter. If you care about how authority works in America, stay with me. Because this story isn't really about one shooting. It's about what happens before the trigger is pulled and who controls the story after. And to understand that, we have to slow down and examine how this moment came to be. To understand this moment, we have to be precise about what is known and, more importantly, what is not. A federal agency says its officers were conducting a targeted operation. A vehicle became stuck. Tensions rose. Commands were issued. Seconds later, a woman was dead. That is the official outline. But outlines are not explanations. What remains unclear is the legal and procedural foundation beneath those actions. Why was this woman stopped? On what authority? Was she being detained, questioned, or arrested, and for what reason? Those questions matter because law enforcement power does not begin with the use of force. It begins with justification. In democracies, force is supposed to be the last link in a long chain of lawful decisions. When that chain is hidden or broken, accountability becomes almost impossible. The videos complicate the story rather than settle it. They show movement, commands, fear but not intent. They show seconds, not context. And without context, we are left arguing over frames instead of systems. To grasp why this keeps happening, we have to step back into history, policy, and the mechanics of modern enforcement. To really understand this, we have to move backward into the systems that produce this moment. Federal immigration enforcement did not begin as a street-level paramilitary presence. Over time, it evolved quietly, incrementally. What began as administrative enforcement slowly adopted the posture of high-risk policing. Operations became targeted. Encounters became tactical. Vehicles became potential weapons. This shift was not driven by one president or one crisis. It was driven by cycles, political pressure, public fear, institutional incentives. Each cycle rewarded speed, decisiveness, and control. Each cycle reduced tolerance for uncertainty. And with every cycle, the margin for error shrank. At the same time, accountability mechanisms grew more distant. Federal officers answer upward, not outward. Investigations became internal before they became public. Narratives hardened before evidence was fully examined. This is how tragedies become structurally predictable. Not inevitable, but increasingly likely. When enforcement is designed to move fast and oversight is designed to move slow, the system tilts toward force. And once force is used, the story often closes, not opens. That is the backdrop against which the shooting occurred. And then came the first critical rupture. What happened next is where the system met the street and fractured. Video shows a vehicle stopped in the roadway, not charging, not accelerating toward a crowd, stopped. An officer approaches from the front. Another moves to the side. Commands are shouted, out of the car. Then movement. A wheel turns, a body shifts, and in that compressed space, seconds thick with adrenaline and uncertainty, the decision is made. This is the first crisis point. Not the gunshots themselves, but the choice to step into danger rather than away from it. Law enforcement training exists for moments like this because human perception under stress is unreliable. Fear narrows vision. Past trauma, intruders, time collapses. Deadly force doctrine is meant to slow that moment down, to impose discipline on instinct. But here, the doctrine itself is now in question. Approaching a vehicle head-on, firing at a moving car, actions that policy typically warns against. If you want to understand why people across the country react so viscerally to incidents like this, it's because they recognize this moment. The moment where procedure gives way to improvisation. And when improvisation carries a gun, the consequences are permanent. If this kind of analysis matters to you, stay with me. Because beneath this crisis lies something more unsettling. Beneath this moment lies the machinery most people never see. This is not simply about one officer's judgment. It is about how systems quietly shape decisions before they feel like choices at all. Federal law enforcement operates inside a hierarchy where control of information is power. Investigations begin internally, statements are centralized, narratives move upward before they move outward. In this case, that machinery activated almost instantly. Top officials declared the shooting justified. The language was decisive. The conclusion arrived before the questions were answered. That matters because once authority speaks with certainty, doubt becomes subversive. Video is reframed. Ambiguity is dismissed. Oversight becomes inconvenient. There is also the hidden psychological mechanism. Officers carry memory. Past violence rewires perception. A previous encounter, a car dragging an officer, does not stay in the past. It walks into the next confrontation. Systems rarely account for that. Policy assumes rational actors. Reality delivers human ones. And then there is the final mechanism, jurisdiction. When federal agencies control the investigation, external scrutiny narrows. State authorities step back. The circle closes. This is how accountability erodes, not loudly, but procedurally. And once that process begins, the second crisis is no longer about force. It's about trust. The second crisis unfolds quietly after the sirens fade. It begins with exclusion. State investigators are told to step aside. A federal inquiry takes over. Jurisdiction becomes a wall, not a bridge. For many Americans, this is where confidence breaks. Not because an investigation exists, but because it feels sealed. Decisions move inward, away from public view, toward institutions already invested in the outcome. And the signals matter. When senior leaders publicly declare an officer's actions justified, they shape the terrain before facts are weighed. They do not merely comment, they prejudge. That has consequences. For prosecutors who must decide whether to act. For investigators who must ask hard questions. For witnesses who must believe their testimony matters. In law enforcement, accountability depends on perceived independence. Remove that, and even a lawful outcome feels illegitimate. This is why similar cases do not fade quietly. They linger. They polarize. They harden belief rather than resolve doubt. The crisis is no longer tactical or legal. It is institutional. And when institutions close ranks, the people left outside begin to ask a different question. Not what happened, but who is this system really for? That question brings us to the human cost. Now let's shift the lens from institutions to you. Imagine being in that intersection, not as an officer or an official, but as a bystander, or as a neighbor, or as someone who watches the video afterward and feels a tightening in the chest you can't quite name, because when lethal force is used, the impact doesn't stop with the person who dies. It radiates outward. You start asking quieter questions. Would I have known what to do? Would I have understood the commands? Would I have been given a chance to explain or only a second to react? For many people, especially those who already feel watched rather than protected, this moment confirms a fear they carry every day. That power moves faster than explanation. That mistakes are final. That accountability is abstract. This is how trust erodes at the human level, not through ideology, but through empathy. If you've ever felt that knot, that sense that the rules change depending on who holds authority, then you understand why this matters beyond politics. Stay with me. Share this conversation if it resonates, because public accountability only exists when private citizens refuse to look away, and the consequences do not stop at city limits. What happens in Minneapolis does not stay in Minneapolis. In a globalized world, the credibility of American law enforcement travels instantly through video, through headlines, through silence. Allies watch, adversaries watch. So do societies struggling with their own questions about power and restraint? The United States often presents itself as a model not because it is perfect, but because it claims the capacity for self-correction. Independent investigations, checks and balances, transparency under pressure. When those mechanisms appear weakened, the message changes. Other governments take notes. Some justify their own excesses by pointing back. Others quietly recalibrate their trust. At home, the effect is cumulative. Each unresolved case becomes part of a larger story, one where federal authority feels insulated and accountability feels conditional. This is not about one administration or one agency. It is about precedent. When force is defended before facts are fully known, a line is drawn. And once drawn, it becomes easier to cross the next time. The real danger is normalization. When extraordinary events start to feel routine, when public outrage fades into weary expectation. And that brings us to the hardest question of all: what comes next? When systems face moments like this, they tend to follow one of three paths. The first is the best-case scenario. A full, credible investigation unfolds. Questions are answered publicly. Policy gaps are acknowledged. Training changes. Oversight expands. Not because pressure demanded it, but because institutions chose legitimacy over defensiveness. In this future, trust does not magically return, but it begins to rebuild. The second path is the most familiar. The investigation concludes quietly. The officer is cleared. Procedures are reviewed internally. No wrongdoing is found. The system absorbs the shock and moves on. Public doubt remains unresolved but normalized. This is stability without confidence. The third path is the most dangerous. Political narratives harden. Scrutiny is framed as hostility. Future encounters are shaped by precedent that decisive force will be publicly defended regardless of ambiguity. In this world, escalation becomes easier than restraint. History tells us systems drift toward the path of least resistance. Not the most, just the most convenient. Which path America takes will not be decided by one report or one prosecutor. It will be decided by whether uncertainty is treated as a threat or as a responsibility. And that choice leads us to the final insight. What this moment ultimately reveals is not a failure of law, but a test of character. Strong systems are not defined by how forcefully they act, but by how honestly they examine themselves afterward. Power that refuses scrutiny does not become safer. It becomes brittle. The question is no longer whether this shooting was justified in a legal sense. That will be argued in reports and courtrooms. The deeper question is whether the process feels worthy of trust. Because in a democracy, legitimacy is not enforced. It is earned again and again. If investigations are closed, if narratives harden too quickly, if uncertainty is treated as disloyalty, then something essential erodes. Not all at once, but permanently. You don't have to choose a side to demand clarity. You don't have to presume guilt to insist on transparency. Those instincts are not radical. They are foundational. If this analysis helped you see the system more clearly, share it. Ask harder questions. Stay engaged. Because the future of accountability is not decided only by officials behind closed doors. It is decided by what the public refuses to accept as normal. And that conversation is only beginning.